Welcome, everyone, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I am delighted to have here with me the vice presidential candidate, Nicole Shanahan, to discuss with me about her candidacy for running for president with Bobby Kennedy, and about her ideas for science, for the reform of science. Nicole, thank you for coming, and thank you for coming to my office to talk with me.
Thank you. Thanks, Jay, for having me. And, I've been following your work for a while now. Thank you for being at my announcement. I'm just so honored to be part of this campaign, which feels like much more meaningful than just running for political office, but really trying to figure out how to restore science and the scientific method.
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, I know something of your background, and we got to know each other a little bit before this. But don't think so many people know about it. I would love for you to be able to have an opportunity to tell people where you're coming from, where you come from, what your experiences are, and what's led you to this point. So you were a lawyer before becoming a vice presidential.
I'm still a lawyer.
You're still a lawyer.
I'm still barred here in California, and before that, I spent my career almost 15 years in intellectual property law. I'm a polymath, so I love all subjects. And one of the ways of dealing with that and not having to pick a specific science or a specific field of engineering was to go into patent law, which gave me an opportunity to meet all kinds of scientists and work on portfolios and innovations from every corner of, the engineering sciences to electrical engineering sciences to biological sciences and computer sciences, and it's it was really a lot of fun, and it led me here to Stanford as well as a fellow.
Well, so science runs in your vein. It was part of who you were before you were vice presidential candidate, and part of your life. You also not just worked in intellectual property, but you've also been very active in funding the sciences. For instance, I know that you worked closely with the National Academy of Medicine on topics like reproductive longevity. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so I was initially looking at longevity through the lens of a patent lawyer, and it was in about 2016, 2017 that I myself was going through a personal experience in reproductive health. And I looked into the science. I realized that there was this whole book of knowledge around ovarian science that hadn't really been filled with new research and new evidence-based treatments. And while I had, experienced kind of what the IVF world was like, I, was really inspired by this opportunity to invest in foundational science around ovarian health, and why it is such a mystery still to so many IVF clinics, why some women come in and are having fertility issues. I mean, even PCOS, something I have a personal experience with, it was at the time very poorly understood. And so I made a commitment at the time to invest $100 million into establishing a real foundational book of science. And we brought in around 100 new scientists to the field. And these are scientists that hadn't worked in women's health before. These were systems biologists, these were endocrinologists, evolutionary biologists. It's been, really wonderful to see. And we actually have more science just in the last 3 years than we had amassed in the prior 50 years.
I think one of the myths about science is that we have all the answers, that we're already done with our understanding of every topic. And certainly during the pandemic, I think it became clear to the public that wasn't true. But even on basic issues like reproduction, there's so much we don't actually know.
Yeah, there's so much we don't actually know, and that is really worth a deep dive into. But if you're not, it really requires somebody coming in and saying, I'm going to fund this for the sake of information and not for the sake of a commercial outcome. Right. Which is really a big difference. Because when you fund something for a commercial outcome, you're going to be looking for a treatment that works for an immediate outcome, right? You're not going to look at, say, root causes, because if you discover the root cause of something, you can't really make money off of that. You can give great advice,
or the very least, the
right?
money you spend
Yeah.
would be like better spent. Like you're not going to spend something patch up a problem that might have been prevented to begin with.
Right, because again, there's no commercial value in
Yeah,
that. So, to be somebody who says, okay, I'm going to invest in this science because it's the right thing to do, versus I'm going to invest in this science because it might translate into something highly profitable for me, these are very different routes. And I think that, we need to support scientists, because the heart of an individual who goes into the profession of science is to do science for the sake of discovery.
yeah,
Scientists, most of them that I've met, anyways, like yourself, aren't going into it to develop some new, billion-dollar drug. And certainly, like, while there are scientists that are, really on that commercial pursuit, there's so many more scientists that really are just deeply, deeply curious about understanding how things work.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for for scientists, if money is the primary motivating factor in your work, you're just going to end up doing bad science. I mean, there's something
It's
you would
biased,
automatically. Yeah, it's like
right?
it's not that I'm against it per se. Like I mean, but you want to have incentives for really bright people to enter science and to do science. But if the primary purpose becomes how do I make money, um, and the second to that is how can I learn how the world works? What's true? Your focus determines what you do.
Absolutely. And it's human nature that when you put bias into something, that the outcome is going to be a little bit different than if you didn't have bias to begin with. And which is why we have, in all of our professional fields, checks and balances around bias
Yeah.
and conflicts.
Okay, so for this big announcement, you're chosen as the vice presidential candidate. You're a lawyer. You're investing in science, working with the National Academy of Medicine. You're also a mom, um, and you have a very busy life already.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now you are a vice presidential candidate.
Yeah. It's been 13 days since the announcement, and my life has definitely evolved in terms of, how I spend my day. But in terms of what I deeply care about, it hasn't changed one bit. Before I embarked on this journey, I was already really focused on understanding chronic disease and understanding how our current healthcare system is organized around chronic disease. I'm in it, every day as a mom of a child impacted with chronic disease. And and I've changed over the last few years how I think about healthcare and science investing. I've evolved my perspective in enormous ways around, even what this pandemic did to our community. I've evolved my thinking around tech, right? Entirely. So I have a venture portfolio, and I completely evolved what I was investing in, because I was like, let's invest in, screens that don't have blue light, right? Display technology that is evolved to think about the impact it's having on a young child who's spending upwards 6 to 8 hours on this device. Most of the technology today is tested for, how human interactions impact the technology, but it's never tested for how the technology is impacting the human body. And that was something I learned from product developers at Apple and Tesla, and it's been very eye opening
Yeah.
to go through this process.
I mean, what I hear is a lot of really interesting scientific curiosity, uh, playing with ideas, asking whether the kinds of scientific ideas that we have that we structure our lives around are right. Um, Essentially, like it's scientific play that you're talking about. Um, So this may sound like I'm changing the subject, but I think it's actually directly related to this. So one of the major themes that I've seen in the Kennedy campaign has been free free speech in science, free speech just generally.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, Nicole, as personally, I felt that during the pandemic. I felt the lack of that during the pandemic. A lot of the folks like me who spoke up about lockdowns, we felt this tremendous pressure to not talk, to not speak. And I'm involved with this lawsuit against the Biden administration called this Missouri versus Biden case brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office, just heard at the Supreme Court. And what we found in the case was a vast effort by the federal government to suppress the speech of scientists that disagreed with government scientists. The CDC, the Surgeon General's office, even the FBI was involved in pressuring social media companies to silence the voices of scientists who disagreed with whether lockdowns were going to be effective, or whether closing schools was a wise thing, whether there ought to be vaccine mandates or not. And on each of these topics, the federal government operated in ways that I think violated our basic free speech rights.
Yeah, they did. And whether or not they were doing so from a true belief that it was for the best interest of the community to not have anyone doubt what they were doing, right? Did they believe that? Right? I think that's
I'm sure they believe that.
Yes. And I do too. I don't believe I like to give everyone the benefit of their earned professional roles, right? Like, and if they believe that this was the right course for everyone's safety and they were doing it and quashing other voices because those voices would make them less effective in their effort, then, that's at the time, in that moment, I can understand that.
I mean, it's understandable,
Yeah.
but at the same time.
But at the same time, in retrospect, when you have no other forum for those voices to come through a due process that allows there to be academic, rigorous, honest, and transparent discussion, scientific discussion amongst the experts, if you remove that, you have made a massive slight upon the First Amendment. There is no argument around that.
Yeah,
right.
So it violates a
Yeah.
basic civil right, our ability to speak freely. But I don't know. I think it's also very bad for science. Like what you do is you create an echo chamber with no capacity for people outside who see the error of. It's not that the government is all knowing.
Yes. Well, I mean, look at what several countries in Europe did. I mean, Sweden and Denmark, they reacted, right, initially, and they saw the world locking down and they participated, but then they allowed scientists to come forward with data.
Yeah, I mean, especially Sweden,
and yeah,
they had a very different policy than the rest of the world, especially early on. And as a result of their allowing scientific debate to happen,
yes,
and allowing there to be this different policy to be put in place, no lockdowns, no closing schools.
Yeah.
They have the lowest all-cause excess deaths in all of Europe, much lower than the United States, much lower than California, much lower than any basically every country in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we know that shutting down scientists with viewpoints, I'm not even going to call them different. I'm just going to call them, you're shutting down scientists with qualified views, is never healthy. It's never a good idea, and it will always result in harm.
Yeah, so let me pick up on that theme. So what you're saying is that free speech is not just that it's civil right, but that it's a necessary condition for health.
It's a foundational condition for health. Free speech, is our First Amendment. Yeah. It's not our eighth. It is a first priority always, because the effect of free speech is really what makes human evolution possible, which is what makes innovation possible. It brings all of the best and brightest minds to the table to work together towards a solution that is actually in the best interest of the population they're serving. Right. And I think that in order to get there, you need to hear all qualified voices, not just the ones that serve some purpose that has already been a trajectory that governments are on or that an organization is on. And, if you look back in history, like even how we discovered how infection spread, right? It was in the late 1800s, midwives were delivering babies and surgeons were delivering babies. And women were worried to go to the surgeons because oftentimes women would die after childbirth, and no one really understood why.
Yeah.
Hand washing. Midwives were hand washing. Surgeons were going from one surgery to another surgery, and they weren't washing their hands, right? And so you have then, these two paths that helped us understand the difference between coming together, right, to come to the true scientific solution that is in the best interest of health and the people that our healthcare system is designed to protect.
So I take it from that answer that a priority of the Kennedy administration will be to restore free speech in this country.
That should be the priority of any administration in America.
I'm sorry to say, I mean, Nicole, I personally have been shocked. I thought it was part of the civic religion of American society, that it's something that bound everyone, regardless of politics.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, during the pandemic, I have to say that hasn't been true, and especially during the Biden administration, it hasn't been true.
Yeah. And it might be given, and I've said this before, I've said this to media outlets, it's our current political climate that has resulted in this. And it's because the stakes are so high, because the division of the two parties has gotten so great and so vitriolic and so full of hatred and so full of perverse incentives to punish the other, right? So now you have these two groups that can't admit fault, because the minute one admits any fault, even when that admission is due, they can't, right? Because if they admit it, the other side is going to completely come and there's no like sportsmanship left anymore.
But see, for me, if I make a mistake or so let's just take it outside of myself. Let's say a student of mine makes a mistake, and then the student says that they made a mistake. I think much more highly of the student after they've done that. I mean, this is just in my life. I'm sure that's true for anyone in our normal. It's no one is perfect, and so I don't. And I think I do think it was quite wrong for the Biden administration to set up this censorship complex. I think it was quite damaging, but I think it would do them credit if they were to say, we'll stop doing this.
I would have so much respect for them.
Yeah.
If they did, and if they understood how the conflicts of interest have led to this moment in history. And I think it will actually help for the recovery of our nation. Yeah. I think it would have such a multiplying effect just in the hearts and minds and spirits of this nation if we had a safe space for people to admit that something was not done correctly, and then also I think acknowledgement of the harm it caused, because you can say sorry, we got it wrong all we want, but then if you do not take responsibility for the harms it's caused in people's lives, and this doesn't need to be necessarily prosecuted, right? But I do think that we need to reestablish the scientific method and acknowledge the fact that free speech has been so deeply infringed upon, especially amongst scientists, right? Because if you look at the fear of going into science today, or the fear of scientists to speak up or to publish the papers they actually want to publish, I've spoken to so many scientists who do not feel comfortable publishing the paper they actually want to publish, so they publish around it, around the recommendation. It's because they're afraid of losing their financing. They're afraid of losing their ability to treat their patient population if they're doing clinical research. They're afraid of being able to, conduct themselves in professional forums.
I mean, they lose social standing for having been dissident.
I mean, and that's even the worst. They lose social standing.
I mean, so
they lose all credit.
I think what you say is so important. Especially the idea that we have to have an honest accounting. In medicine, there's this idea, after a patient dies, often what happens in hospitals is that there'll be a little conference called a morbidity and mortality conference, M&M conference, where you do a discussion, a very frank discussion about what went wrong. The idea isn't to point fingers. The idea is to say, here's what went wrong. Here's the system. Maybe it might have been a mistake by some person. And the goal is to make sure that it doesn't happen again. It's not to blame the person, but to reform the system so that we don't make the same mistake again.
Exactly. And I believe that we can get there, but we do also have to acknowledge who in that room has a commercial conflict of interest. And they shouldn't be in that room because that would corrupt that process from getting to where it needs to be, which is improvement without persecution, right?
Right. Okay, so let's move on to a topic that's near and dear to my heart, especially before the pandemic. This was a primary area of my research. So the American healthcare system is incredibly inefficient and incredibly expensive. I think we spend something like $1.05. We spend of our GDP is spent on healthcare. With something that comes out to $10,000, $12,000, $13,000 per person. It's an incredible amount of money, but the results that we get are really bad. We have among the lowest life expectancies in the world, among the developed countries in any case. The question is, what produces such a bad result? How is it that in both senses, both the economic sense of spending a lot of money, but also not getting the help you would expect to get out of it?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to say that I have so much respect for our doctors and our medical professionals and nurses. I am so grateful to this community of people that works tirelessly every day to try to meet their patients' needs. So I think it's first and foremost, it's always important to say that it's not necessarily the quality of the people in our system. The quality of people in our system is exceptionally high. We have some of the best trained, oncologists, the best trained cardiologists. We have imaging that's like some of the best in the world.
My wife is a radiation oncologist. So I have some
radiation oncology. We have some of the best radiation oncologists. I mean, I have been so grateful for the healthcare professionals that I've worked with throughout my lifetime. So that's not the problem. What is the problem? So chronic disease in this country is astronomical. It's higher than any developed nation. So we have to start looking outside of our borders to understand what are we doing different that other countries aren't doing, right? Or what are we doing that they aren't doing, right? Like we need to start doing this cross-sectional analysis to understand how far it is our country in terms of supporting health is different. Like there's something different. What is it? So, in speaking with some of the experts and like a lot of our frontline healthcare professionals are getting really burnt out. Like I've talked to OBGYNs that are just cracking right now because they're seeing, women who seem healthy that are really struggling to carry a pregnancy to full term. Like I'm seeing pediatricians who have major client books of pandas, like, and like to the extent that it becomes now the majority of their client base are kids with chronic disease.
It's not just kids, adults also a major
Mm-hmm.
chronic disease problems with incredibly high rates of obesity and overweight, diabetes at
Yeah.
astronomically high levels of the adult population. Of course, Alzheimer's disease,
Mm-hmm.
a whole range of real severe problems that are afflict just an incredible fraction of the American population.
It's devastating. It is devastating this country. It's devouring this country from the inside. And so this is the moment in history that like every single campaign should be focused on this issue. And I think that, the way that Bobby has been talking about it and thinking about it, and has dedicated his whole career is trying to understand what is causing the rate of chronic disease. We can keep throwing taxpayer dollars at more and more drugs and more hospitals and more doctors. But like, if that is to treat an ever increasing number of patients with chronic disease, it will put us into everlasting debt and put us into an everlasting economic crisis that we won't be able to pedal out of. So we can't continue on this track. We all know that. So the question is, so then what? The then what to me is very, very clear. We need to investigate. We already have early evidence that like glyphosate, this one's like low hanging fruit, right? Many countries in Europe have banned glyphosate use. We need to ban glyphosate use.
It's like a pesticide used to grow genetically modified foods.
Correct.
Yeah.
Then we need to start understanding how to get each and every home in this country clean water that isn't just dumped full of chemicals to eradicate.
Well, I mean, it's not that
microbes.
long ago we had this terrible situation in Michigan, Flint, Michigan, with dirty. I mean, we think of dirty water as a problem of elsewhere, poor countries, but it's not just a problem of poor countries.
No, our method of dealing with it right now is chemical inputs. But we know that chemical inputs are disrupting our cellular health and our ability to function at a cellular level as we should be. But sorry, go on.
No, please go ahead.
So filtration systems, right? We can actually deal with many of the water impurities with filtration systems. So resorting each and every time to more and more fluoride or even chlorine, we need to look at alternatives. Countries such as Israel have actually dealt with this. Singapore has dealt with this as well. Clean drinking water is something that if we invested a quarter of what we spend annually on drugs to treat the diseases that dirty water have caused, right? We could actually prevent much of the chronic disease issue by just ensuring people have access to really, really clean, healthy water.
Right. So I'm hearing investments in rethinking basic public health systems.
Yeah, and redefining what those public health systems should look like. Food and soil and our food supply chain. We know that like healthy soil with high soil organic matter, so all of the microbes that make soil alive and produce food that is full of nutrients, because we get the entirety of the nutrients from the soil. We know that our body can digest these things, that it can help gastrointestinal issues. I mean, how many people are taking medications for gastrointestinal issues? I mean, so many. It's even in my community of friends, so many.
So let me translate it to my health economics world language. I'm hearing investments in public health, basic rethinking of public health,
priorities,
investments in agriculture, rethinking how we do agriculture. But what about healthcare systems? Like, what about hospitals and how we pay doctors and all? Because we do spend a lot of money. And the other side of it is that there remain tens of millions of people in this country who don't really have good access to basic healthcare.
So we're building more and more hospitals. So the largest spend on healthcare is on hospitals. The second largest spend is on doctors, and then the third is on drugs. These are organizations, many of which are privately owned, that are trying. I mean, our entire healthcare system is effectively privatized, right? And much of the payers, government payers, but it's a response to the chronic health crisis, right? I'm not going to say stop spending on hospitals. Hospitals are important institutions. What I do think we absolutely need to do is understand that if we continue on this trajectory of just funding more hospitals and more doctors, and these hospitals can't keep up, right? That's the thing. The hospitals and the doctors can't keep up. So oftentimes they resort to drugs to manage the symptoms because the healthcare system can't actually provide services that make people better, right?
So the idea would be to prevent people from having to need those things to begin with.
We need preventative healthcare, right? We need healthcare professionals who aren't playing whack-a-mole with symptoms and their only tool being prescribing new drugs to patients. We all know that once you're on a drug, it's really hard to get off of it because your body becomes entirely dependent on that drug to function. And in that sense, those drugs are very heroic, right? But we have to understand how we got this influx of patients in the first place.
But of course the incentives that a lot of doctors face and hospitals face is to prescribe the expensive drug, right? Just take an oncology. A lot of effort and time is devoted to finding a new drug, a patented drug that maybe extends life a month or two at the cost of sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. How do you change those incentives?
Well, for one, I think that we live in a capitalistic society that is just by design creates businesses where opportunities are found, right? I was just looking at a company not long ago that was selling me behavioral services for the population of individuals with autism diagnoses. And there was one slide that really gutted me. And they said, this is a $7.6 trillion market, are individuals with autism. And it really hurts me to be in that place, right? Because on one hand, capitalism is a wonderful thing. On another, if sick people are being viewed as business opportunities, there is a massive potential, and we see it time and time again. Bobby talks about this all the time, to take advantage of it. Right. And there's no incentive, there's no business incentive to reduce those numbers of needy people. And it's the government's responsibility, and it's the responsibility of individuals who don't have those conflicts to be leading the charge of the solutions. Right? It is such a deep responsibility, and it is the expectation of our leadership to not be conflicted by those business interests. And that's why we talk so much about corporate capture, which has become, thematic in this campaign. But when you really think about what that means, you are able to understand perhaps how we've gotten to this moment of devastation.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting new sponsor, Alchemy Elements. We've been shopping around trying to find the best sponsors that align with our mission and our values and what we stand for. And we've come across Alchemy Elements, which I'm very excited to bring to you guys, which is a synergistic herbal supplement. It's a mix of several adaptogenic plant compounds. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens, you might have heard on Andrew Huberman's podcast, are plant medicines that help the body adapt to stress, essentially. And so there's a number of adaptogens in here, including cordyceps mushrooms, reishi mushrooms, astragalus, shilajit, polygala, lion's mane mushrooms, and other compounds as well. And you just take a tablespoon of this, you put it in your morning coffee or your smoothie or protein shake, and you're good to go. I've been doing this for about a week, and as it suggests, some of the short-term effects of increased focus, increased concentration, more energy. I've already been feeling some of that. Look forward to taking it more in the long term and reporting back as we do more of these ads. We've been very careful and selective in what to sponsor on our program, and this is something that I can totally get behind. And as long as you keep hearing ads about this particular product, Alchemy Elements, you can be assured that this is something that I stand behind and can personally vouch for and recommend individuals try. So for a limited time right now, people who are watching or listening to this podcast, they can get a 10% discount on their first order, or they can get a 30% discount for all subscription orders if you subscribe for a certain amount of deliveries per month. And if you order a subscription package, then you can get the premium gold kit as well, which includes this really nice gold bottle and a gold spoon to store your Alchemy Elements. Just use the code word illusion. If you're on Spotify or Apple or Substack, we'll drop a link below, or you can manually type in alchemyelements.com and you can add your products to the cart, and you can put in the code illusion, and you can get the 10% off discount for the first order or 30% off for the subscription order, and you can get your gold kit. Thank you so much to Alchemy Elements. Please check them out, and I hope you enjoy their products. All right, back to the show.
So let's drill down on that, and let's talk about some particulars, right? Because I think during the course of the last 4 years, I've never seen in my professional career such a huge collapse in the public trust in the mechanisms of the regulatory bodies of the United States that govern health, the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, all have failed in pretty fundamental ways. And as you're right, we rely on them to not fail. We rely on them to tell us the truth about what scientific evidence is saying, to evaluate drugs for their safety, to make scientific investments in research investments in a wise way. But in each of those areas, those basic fundamental areas, the federal government has failed, in my view. And so the question is, what can we do to come back to the thing that you're talking about, which is a federal scientific infrastructure that actually works, that has earned back the trust of the American people because they're trustworthy?
It's really interesting. I'm a lawyer, and part of legal professional ethics is screening for conflicts of interest. So you can't actually take on a client unless that client has gone through a conflicts check at the law firm level and at the lawyer level. That's not happening at the federal agency level. So like you have situations in which you have advisors, or Fauci was a major advisor during the pandemic, and you later realize he's deeply conflicted in his interest, right? Based on his business dealings and vaccine development, and based on his business dealings with for-profit pharmaceutical companies. So first and foremost, we need to be screening. It's just a real obvious, it's a real obvious need.
I mean, there's a law called the Bayh-Dole Law. It was passed in the 1980s that allows NIH employees to patent their discoveries. And now all of a sudden they have an incentive to make sure that their discoveries are the ones that get
the priority.
Yes.
Yeah. From a perspective on perverse incentives, that would seem like a perverse incentive. That would seem like something that is not in the best interest of the American public. You have a system of favoritism. It also sends a chilling effect downstream to all of the scientists who are doing this from organizations that don't get that priority, and that sends a chilling effect to them because it says to them, you're not as important. Yeah. Your discovery is not as important, and we will not prioritize you. So we do need to bring back an equal playing field amongst scientists. And
for the NIH, right? So the NIH, I mean, it's quite possible from the evidence I've seen that the NIH invested in the research that actually caused the pandemic. I mean, we don't know that for certain, but it's certainly a possibility. And certainly they've invested in research that, to my eyes, look like dangerous research with very little outcome, a positive outcome to be gained from it, like investing in research that makes pathogens more dangerous with an idea toward. Okay, so
yeah.
I've been trying to think about how you might address this. What the root problem is. It seems to me that the root problem is that you have scientists that are talking to themselves and they've talked themselves into a corner with very little input from regular people. You don't have, like, if a regular person listens to say, well, wait, if this escapes out of a lab and everyone else gets sick, then why? And they'd be, oh, well, we get to know all these things. Well, the risk is all these people get sick. We shouldn't be doing it. Is there a way to bring sort of like democratic input back into how the NIH makes decisions about scientific investments it makes?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I started working on women's reproductive health, we effectively created a global consortium, right? We put together a pool of funds that went through this double-blind process for grant making, where everything about an individual's organization, their, like who they are as an individual is redacted. And we just looked at their proposal. And we created a global consortium that invited any researcher from any institution around the world to submit. And that kind of grant making process results in really pulling together the best and brightest, but it also sends the message that we really want to foster an, real, true, equal playing field amongst all these scientists. The NIH oftentimes will look at what's happening in the private sector of research funding, and it will influence how they do it, right? So that kind of does happen in some ways. The NIH has actually since released a pool of funding for women's reproductive longevity research. It's tiny, but
that struck me as a success story of patient giving feedback to the NIH, that saying, look, these are our priorities. Patient groups have had great success over the years. The HIV community is a good example of this. In changing the priorities that the scientists undertake. It seems to me like one of the problems during the lead up to the pandemic is these investments in dangerous gain of function work. It wouldn't have survived if they'd had to sell it to people.
No, and it wouldn't have survived if you really did do this kind of double blind submission of research papers. And so I think that, what I would love to see happen is there's various ways to collect evidence, right? Community health evidence. They can be through surveys, they can be through advocacy groups. Like there's all of these great advocacy groups of moms, of kids with chronic disease. Like those forums already exist, but they're not empowered right now to have any communication really with the NIH. There's no forum. And in fact, NIH really looks at health from, we kind of know everything and we're just gonna, we have the most sophisticated experts and you should be listening to us. But we all know that the progression of science has never really worked that way. I mean, let's just go back to how we discovered how infections, spread. It really took this Hungarian doctor to start paying attention to what the midwives were saying.
Someone was, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was a magical moment in the progression of our species, in the progression of science and healthcare.
Hand washing, something very simple, right?
Right.
But it was the midwives that actually made the discovery, and Semmelweis was just picking up on it.
He was listening.
Yeah.
He was listening, and that's what needs to happen right now. And I actually think that, with a shift in perspective, we get there very quickly, that we can actually start really solving a lot of our hardest, hardest issues. Like spread of infection was a really hard issue in the 1800s.
Yeah.
Especially as it related to surgery and childbirth. And look at what that discovery resulted in. I mean, one of the most important discoveries of all time. So if the NIH...
It doesn't cost anything. You just wash your hands.
It doesn't literally cost nothing.
Yeah.
And people are oftentimes like, well, how do we democratize healthcare? It's through discoveries like that that truly are no cost. And so, where we are today in 2024 is, I think, in a very similar just situation in which you have these experts that have just been doing things the same way for so long, but we now have problems that aren't being solved, right? And so how do we overcome it? We look at how we've overcome it in the past, and we do that again.
So that's the NIH. The FDA.
No, yeah.
The FDA. I say this with some sadness because I have worked with the FDA in the past extensively on safety of biologics and other things. I have great respect for many of the scientists at the FDA. But I have to say, during the pandemic, it looked like the FDA forgot how to do science, forgot that they were working on behalf of the American people rather than pharmaceutical companies. In fact, at the heart of 2021, during the discussion over whether the FDA should approve COVID vaccine boosters, two of the top scientific officials of the FDA resigned because they were protesting the lack of scientific rigor in the evaluation by the FDA of the boosters. Mm-hmm. That's a major scandal. It points to a major problem at the FDA. So what's your diagnosis of the problems and how should we fix it?
Truly, it was a scandal. They called it Project Warp Speed, right? And I think we are still understanding, and it will take us years to understand the full impacts of what vaccine injury looks like.
I mean, it's already bad enough now. You have lots of young men with myocarditis, for instance, that didn't need to have it if we just paid attention to the data early enough.
Yeah. I think we're going to see many, many, many other diseases that we are going to learn if we allow the process to ensue that are associated with it.
But of course, not just this vaccine. It's just it's a pointer to a more general problem at the FDA, I think.
Well, it is definitely a problem with the FDA, but you have to also understand that the FDA is an organization of individuals, many of which are good, professionals.
I work with them.
Yeah,
they're good scientists.
There's a lot of good scientists at the FDA, but let's even take a step back. Vaccine development exists today in a legal framework that gives them total immunity from products liability, total immunity from harm, right? Which means that you are going to be allowed to do these rollouts of new vaccines without proper testing. Nothing stops that, and nothing actually incentivizes vaccine manufacturers to think about, well, if I do this, I'll be held liable, because they're not held liable, right? By law, they're not held liable.
That's true, and I'm against that. I think there shouldn't be that liability. That liability protection.
There shouldn't be total immunity.
Yeah, but at the same time, the FDA has a job. It's supposed to be independent of that. It's supposed to police that. So if a vaccine manufacturer says, "Oh, I love this vaccine. This is a great vaccine," the FDA says, "Well, show me a large randomized trial with a real clinical outcome, with a great control group, that treated with placebo, and it shows some benefit for the people that take the drug versus the placebo. I mean, they can require that.
They can require it, and they ought to require it.
If they didn't during the pandemic, and it was shocking to me, especially for the booster. They were looking at relatively small trials. At one point, they approved it on the basis of one of these boosters based on evidence from mice and no humans.
Yeah, that would never be allowed for any other drug.
Yeah. So what needs to change the FDA? Like how do we fix that?
Well, I think if you lifted complete immunity and required proper testing.
Well, that's the private side, but I think the government side also is a failure. It seems like there's this revolving door of FDA officials going into working for the FDA and then going work in pharma.
Yeah. And look, I understand it's because the pool of individuals, like if you want to run an agency that's responsible for, issuing the safety of pharmaceuticals and, looking at clinical trials, the pool to pull from, the largest pool is going to be from our pharmaceutical companies, private pharmaceutical companies. How do you screen that? Right? We don't screen that today, but we can certainly screen who has existing interest before they come in and head up FDA efforts. So screening, again, let's go back to screening. It's just like a basis of all professional ethics is ensuring that there's no deep conflicts of interest in the population of professionals who you are entrusting with safety. Right. And entrusting with a, liberty. Right. And if health is, I believe that health is a fundamental right. You have to make sure that there's no room for corruption in the delivery of that right.
Yeah. Completely wholeheartedly agree with that. Okay, so last agency before we move on, it is we've talked about the NIH, the FDA. Let's talk a little bit about the CDC. And I'll just give you my view. I think the CDC failed to read scientific evidence correctly. They shielded themselves during the pandemic from criticism from outside scientists. Mm-hmm. And the way that the agency is the power structure of it, when it makes some guidance, it's not formal law, mm-hmm. but it's often treated as if it were the last word on scientific evidence, when in fact it's not actually the last word. How do we address that? How do we fix that?
Again, it's a similar issue of community coordination, right? Your community, if you're the CDC, are all the epidemiologists across the country. And that is your community that you should be consulting with. Going back to what we discussed earlier, that there was no forum at the CDC for the entry of science from this community of epidemiologists and public health experts, and that anything that conflicted was really ostracized, right? It was discredited immediately without any due process or without any deep consideration as to what went into that input that was being provided. That again, that is a failure of the CDC to do what it is designed to do in a time of crisis.
It hunkered down and said, okay, we're going to ignore everyone else. We're just going to believe what we believe. And if there's outside criticism, it must be from fringe figures rather than real legitimate attempts to engage in scientific debate.
Yeah, it's hard for me to understand how that happened. I'm still, backtracking and trying to figure out, was it due to political pressure from the White House? Where was that pressure coming from for them to take that stance and effectively, put themselves within this impenetrable bubble that was unwilling to listen to any experts, outside of that bubble. Yeah. And it's a very weird thing that happened. It's very, it's a very, very odd thing. I think going forward, there should be an expectation of community-based comment. You see that even at the WHO, right? That they will release comments, like an opportunity for comments to be submitted, and then they receive those comments. They review those comments, and those comments oftentimes they're intended to influence and direct the course and decision of how the WHO takes a stance on a certain disease or a certain health issue. The fact that didn't happen, or it couldn't happen at the time of the pandemic, is it's very alarming. It's very alarming, and it is counter to everything that this country is really founded on. And it's really anti-science. I mean, I don't want to just throw around that word lightly, but when you are a government agency like the CDC, designed to be acting in the best interest of the American public and unwilling to listen to experts within that population, that is a failure.
Yeah. Well, that's a fantastic answer. Music to my ears. So, okay, so last topic that I wanted to address, because I think it's, to me, probably the most important, as far as like my priorities are concerned. I think during the pandemic, what we saw was a collapse in our society's commitment to educating our kids. We closed schools for longer than almost any other developed country. Many of our kids, especially our poorest kids, are years behind in learning loss, and we know from an extensive social science literature that has consequences that will impact them their entire life. That they'll be poorer, that they'll be less healthy as a consequence of this failure of we, the adults, to care for our kids, to invest in our kids.
Yeah. I have a lot of strong opinions about the state of education in our country and the impact that locking kids away from one another has had, not just on their ability to do math or science, but in their entire ability to function socially and their ability to feel confident and to their ability to, enjoy childhood, right? Childhood is a sacred gift. And children need interaction with other children to play. We are seeing some of the science on play-based education and experiential-based education, saying that like, well, we got all these kids on, electronic classrooms. That is completely insufficient and lacks any understanding of how childhood development works. Childhood development requires kids to be around each other to play, right? Play is how a child's brain develops. It's how it learns. Experience is how children take in information and interpret it into knowledge. Without that, no matter how many online tools you give a child, they're not developing for success. They develop for success when they're in a community of other young people. And so what we've done to children is so much worse than just saying, they're not going to pass a standardized test. Like, it is so much worse than that on so many levels. I mean, the rate of screen time has gone through the roof. We know that kids who spend too much time on screens don't feel well.
I mean, there's anxiety, there's depression at levels I've never seen it before. Substance abuse in youth is as skyrocketed as it has with young adults. We face real problems with this, and so the question is, like, it's one thing to lament the mistakes we've made; they're bad enough. We should never make them again.
Yep.
But also, how do we care for the people that have suffered as a result, the kids that have suffered as a result? How do we try to make good? How do we make their lives better?
Well, the solution is not to drug them. That is the wrong path. We have to, one, like, these children are smart and they are resilient. So we need a solution for encouraging them in this moment that is based on the fact that they are smart and that they are resilient. What do really smart children want to hear? They want to hear the truth. They want to hear that a mistake was made. that they were kept home for 2 years, taken away from their friends and their social group, and that how they feel today is absolutely valid based on what has happened to them. Yeah. We have to acknowledge it. Then we have to understand that these are incredibly resilient young people, and we need to foster environments that help them remember what it is they lost. Because the thing is most families don't even understand the gravity of what these children have lost. They lost play and experience and connection. So how do we get them as much play, as much experience, and as much connection as we can? It doesn't mean just increasing time in the classroom. I believe that what we need to do is look to the child development experts and provide play-based opportunities in the summertime, because we know that summer is the biggest gap for low-income families of like, where do I send my child during summer when I can't send them to school? Like, that's probably one of the best investments we can make into the future of these kids, is to give them play-based summer opportunities.
Okay, well, it's a big thing, big challenge I think we have ahead of us for that. But Nicole, I've taken a lot of time out of your very busy schedule. I know you must be facing so many demands on it as a vice presidential candidate, but I'm grateful that you have spent time with me, and I know the audience will appreciate hearing your thoughts and what the Kennedy administration plans to do on important issues.
I mean, Jay, thank you for weathering the storm. Thank you for your commitment to doing this from a place of integrity. I hope that what you inspire in other scientists is that they no longer need to filter what they know and believe to be true, that we can have a true scientific freedom movement in this country. That is my greatest hope. And that and I believe that is the path forward and the path out of this.
Thank you very much. So this has been Jay Bhattacharya for the Illusion of Consensus podcast with Nicole Shanahan, vice presidential candidate with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for 2024.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.